Each year in Canada, tens of thousands of criminal investigations begin quietly, long before they become headlines. Most are resolved, some are not. Our podcast examines the evidence, the legal thresholds, and the decisions that shape what happens next. This is Northern Dark, True Canadian Crime. Documented, structured, and examined without noise. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for being here. Today we're taking you back to 1982. A family leaves for a camping trip in British Columbia, far enough from everything that the world goes quiet around them. No traffic, no witnesses, just trees, distance, and time, moving a little slower than it does anywhere else. 6 people go in. None of them come back. Years later, the man responsible, David Ennis, is convicted and sentenced to life in prison. And that should be where the story ends. But it doesn't. Because a life sentence doesn't close the case. It keeps it alive. Decades later, it comes back. Reviewed, reassessed, reopened, and this time, it won't happen in a courtroom. No hearing, no room, no voices from the victims' families, only paper. And for the families, that means the story isn't just remembered, it's repeated. Before this became a case, it was a family trip. In 1982, George and Edith Bentley traveled into a remote part of British Columbia with their daughter Jackie Johnson, her husband Bob, and their 2 daughters, aged 11 and 13. It was the kind of trip families take without documenting it. No record of the exact route, no time-stamped moments, just a decision to leave everything behind for a few days and go somewhere quieter. They found a spot and stopped. Not a crowded campground, not a place with constant movement, just a clearing. A place that offered distance and stillness. They set up and stayed there, together. Everything they needed was contained within that small space. Their vehicle, their supplies, their shelter. The outside world narrowed to the immediate surroundings of the campsite. Time would have moved differently there, marked by light and darkness rather than schedules. There is no verified record of what they did that day, but there is also no indication that anything felt wrong, no reason to leave. No signal that anything had changed. The isolation would have felt like control. No noise, no interruption, no one nearby. But that same distance meant something else. If someone entered that space, there would be no one to notice. No one to pass by. No one to hear anything that didn't belong. At some point, that's exactly what happened. Someone came into a place that wasn't meant to be shared. There was no warning carried in from outside. No interruption that broke the moment early. Whatever began there did not stop. It unfolded fully inside that one location, without interference, without witnesses, and without any way for the family to be heard beyond the boundaries of that campsite. By the time anyone understood what had happened, the place itself had already gone quiet again, and everything that followed would have to be reconstructed from what was left behind. He did not arrive as part of the story. At the time, David Ennis was already in that area of British Columbia, moving through the same remote landscape the Bentley and Johnson family had chosen for their trip. He was not connected to them. There is no evidence that they knew him, recognized him, or had any reason to anticipate his presence. From their perspective, the isolation of that location meant privacy. From his position, it meant access. What is known is not built on speculation, but on what was later established through the investigation and court proceedings. Ennis encountered the family at their campsite. This was not a passing moment or a brief interaction. Once he entered that space, the dynamic changed immediately, from a controlled, familiar environment to one dictated entirely by him. He was armed. He had the ability to control movement, to prevent escape, and to isolate individuals within an already isolated setting. The distance that separated the campsite from the outside world now worked in only one direction. There was no one close enough to intervene, and no immediate way for the family to reach help. The encounter did not end quickly. Instead, it extended over time, with control maintained throughout. The 2 young girls were separated from the others and held for several days. This is a confirmed detail of the case. What happened during that period is documented in court findings, but the specifics do not need to be repeated to understand the structure of the crime: prolonged captivity, sustained control, and no interruption. By the time the sequence of events reached its end, all 6 members of the family were dead. The location had not changed. The environment had not shifted. The same isolation that defined the beginning of the trip remained constant through everything that followed. The difference was that now no one was left inside it. And for investigators, that created a different kind of problem. There were no witnesses to interview, no surviving accounts to reconstruct the timeline from inside the scene. Everything they would come to understand about what happened there would have to be built from what remained after the fact. The first indication that something was wrong did not come from the campsite itself. It came later, when the family did not return, when contact stopped, when absence became the only signal that something had changed. From there, the search began, moving outward into a landscape that does not give up information easily. Remote terrain slows everything down. It limits visibility, delays discovery, and stretches the time between event and understanding. What investigators eventually found was not a scene in progress. It was the aftermath. The family's vehicle had been burned. Inside it were the remains of the 6 victims. That detail would become central to the case, not just because of what it revealed, but because of what it concealed. Fire removes clarity. It alters timelines, damages evidence, and forces investigators to rely on reconstruction rather than direct observation. From that point forward, the work shifted from searching to piecing together. There were no witnesses to interview, no one who had seen the moment the situation changed. Everything had to be inferred from physical evidence, from what could be recovered, and from what could be verified through forensic analysis. The condition of the scene indicated control, duration, and intent, but not a straightforward sequence of events. What investigators were left with was a closed environment and a completed act. 6 victims, 1 location, no immediate explanation. And the question that would drive the next phase of the case: who had been there, and how had they been able to carry this out without being seen? By the time investigators understood what they were dealing with, the case had already moved past the point of immediate response. There was no active scene to interrupt, with no suspect identified in real time and no witness account pointing in a clear direction. What they had instead was a completed crime in a remote location, and a timeline that had to be rebuilt from the outside in. Every step forward depended on reconstruction, where the family had been, how long they had been there, and who else had access to that area during that window. The geography mattered. Remote terrain limits the number of people who pass through, but it also makes tracking movement more difficult. There are fewer records, fewer cameras, fewer incidental witnesses. Investigators had to rely on physical evidence recovered from the site and from the burned vehicle, along with any traceable movements connected to that region at the time. At some point, the focus narrowed. Attention shifted toward a single individual, David Ennis, who had been in the area during that period. His presence was not theoretical. It was something that could be placed within the same geographic space, within a relevant time frame. From there, the investigation moved from possibility to connection. What followed was not immediate closure, but progression. Evidence linked him to the crime. That link was tested, examined, and ultimately brought into court. Because in a case with no surviving witnesses, the threshold for certainty is higher, and everything the investigators had built would now have to hold under scrutiny. The investigation eventually reached a point where it stopped expanding outward and began to narrow. After working through a case with no surviving witnesses and a scene that had already been altered, investigators were able to connect the events in that remote campsite to one person, David Ennis. His presence in the area was not incidental. It aligned with the time frame, the location, and the physical evidence that had been gathered. What had started as a wide search through a difficult landscape became a focused case built around a single suspect. The arrest did not bring immediate clarity to what had happened inside that campsite, but it established responsibility in a way the investigation alone could not. From that point forward, the process shifted into the courtroom, where the standard changed. It was no longer about building a theory, it was about proving it. During the trial, the case was presented through evidence rather than narrative. There were no direct accounts from inside the scene, no surviving voices to describe what had happened. Everything had to be demonstrated through what could be verified: timelines, forensic findings, and the connections that placed Ennis within that sequence of events. The court ultimately found him guilty. The sentence imposed was life imprisonment, with no eligibility for parole for 25 years. Within Canadian law, that carries a specific meaning. It is not a fixed term. It does not expire. It establishes that the individual will remain under a life sentence, with the possibility, only the possibility, of conditional release after a set period. At that moment, the case reached what appears to be its endpoint. The investigation was complete. The trial had concluded. Responsibility had been assigned, and for a time, it held there. But the structure of that sentence ensured something else, that the case would not remain closed indefinitely. After the sentence is delivered, the case appears to stop. The courtroom empties, the decision is recorded, and the system moves forward to the next file. A life sentence with no eligibility for parole for 25 years carries the weight of permanence. It signals that the most serious outcome available under Canadian law has been imposed. And for a moment, it can feel like an ending, something complete, something settled, something that will not need to be revisited again. But that is not how the sentence is structured. In Canada, a life sentence includes review. After the period of ineligibility passes, the case returns through the parole system, not once, but repeatedly, at set intervals. Each time, the same question is asked again, not about what happened, but about what happens next. Risk is reassessed, behavior is evaluated. The possibility of release is considered within a legal framework that is designed to function over time. For David Ennis, that process is no longer theoretical. It is active, ongoing, and built into the remainder of his life sentence. According to recent reporting by Global News, the next parole review is scheduled for August 2026, and it will proceed as a paper review rather than an in-person hearing. That distinction is procedural, but it changes the experience of the process in a fundamental way. There is no room, no live exchange, no moment where individuals are physically present while the decision is being considered. The offender has waived the right to attend, which allows the board to move forward based entirely on written submissions. Families can still provide input, but it exists only on the page, filed, reviewed, and weighed without being spoken aloud in the moment. At the same time, the process continues to evaluate possibilities that remain conditional but real within the system itself. Transfer to a lower security institution. Consideration for day parole. No outcome has been decided, and no release has been granted, but the structure requires that these possibilities be examined as part of each review. The system does not stop to reflect on the severity of the past. It applies its framework consistently, asking the same question at each interval, regardless of how much time has passed. For the system, this is continuity. It is how the law is designed to function, measured, procedural, and repeatable. For the families, it is something else entirely. Because while the process moves forward, they remain fixed to a moment that does not change. The loss does not evolve. It does not become procedural. And yet, they are required to return to it each time the case is reviewed, to respond again, to engage again, to place themselves back inside something that, for them, never ended. Recent public statements reflect that shift, not an absence of involvement, but a reduction of it, less presence, less ability to stand inside the process in a way that feels direct or acknowledged. And over time, that difference becomes part of the story. The case continues, the reviews repeat, the decisions are made, but the distance between what the system resolves and what the families carry does not close. It widens, because in one version of this case, everything has already been decided, and in the other, it is still being decided, again and again, without an endpoint. A sentence can define a punishment, but it doesn't define an ending. In this case, the system continues to revisit something the families never left. George and Edith Bentley, Jackie and Bob Johnson, and their 2 daughters. 6 lives that do not move forward with each review, even as the process does. Time passes inside the system. Files are reopened, reassessed, and decided again. But outside of it, nothing about what was taken changes. The names remain, the loss remains, and the distance between those 2 realities does not close. That difference between what the law resolves and what people carry is where this story still exists. That's it for tonight, everyone. Thanks for being here. Until next Monday, take care of each other.